we're gonna throw a term at you. You help us as Christian adults and leaders and parents to think through some of these things. Okay, here's the first term: race. Go.
It's made up. It's you'll hear in the culture, race is a social construct. You'll hear that phrase everywhere. It's really an idea that comes out of the Enlightenment. The idea of ranking humans according to a hierarchy, according to their melanin, with the light-skinned people at the top, the dark-skinned people at the bottom, and that their value is attached to lighter skin being more valuable, darker skin being less valuable. This is a complete fiction that we all participate in. And in fact, we encourage Christians to try as much as possible to get the word race out of their vocabulary and to talk about ethnicity or nationality. What nation are you from? What people group are you from? What region are you from? But these are more biblical ways of thinking about it. But the scriptures don't know anything about race. It was made up in the late 1600s.
But bad ideas can have bad consequences. And I think that's also okay to talk about with kids. So the bad idea of race and this ranking of people by skin color had some really bad consequences, which led to things like, slavery or more specifically, the transatlantic slave trade and chattel slavery. It has led to, things like eugenics or, certain ideas that are very bad. And so talking about the bad idea of race can also lead people into some of the bad ideas that, the conversation of race has led to, and why it's important to actually be accurate and truthful in our conversations regarding humans, because when we have bad ideas, bad consequences usually follow.
Okay. Second term to define: racism.
Racism in the culture is prejudice plus power. Again, that definition was introduced in the 1970s. Prior to that, it just kind of had a more generic definition of an expression of prejudice, overtly from one individual to another individual or a group. But now the prejudice plus power definition is part of a larger conversation of systemic racism. I talk in the book, I think I mentioned 6 different definitions of racism. There were more, it could have been 15. Like there's all these different little nuances. Again, I think this is a fairly unhelpful term, not biblical. And we look at what we call the sin of racism as being some combination of the sins in the Bible of hatred in your heart or slander against your neighbor based on their ethnicity, ethnic partiality, which is a favoritism or a denigration of people or groups based on their ethnicity or nationality. And then this one is not in the book, but I would probably add it if I were to ever do an update to that chapter, which is idolatry based on your ethnicity.
I wanted to just say something too. Another term associated with racism is reverse racism. Reverse racism is not a helpful term. Let me explain. When we think about racism in our country, the majority of times we think about white people poorly treating people of color. And then we say, well, if a white person is treated bad because of the color of their skin, it's reverse racism. That's not actually true. That's completely made up. The idea of ethnic partiality is one sinful heart to another. When we say things like reverse racism, that means that racism is going in the wrong way. Our cars aren't built to go in reverse. Can it go in reverse? Yes, for me to get out of a parking spot or for a special situation, but I drive going forward. And so when we mention things or when we teach kids things like the idea of reverse racism, what we're really saying is that racism was never meant to go toward white people. That's completely untrue. Racism goes from one sinful heart to another. Ethnic partiality, ethnic idolatry, or hatred, or slander, whatever, favoritism, it's always because my heart is sinful and thinking probably a little bit more of myself or a little bit less of someone else than I really should. And that is an issue of sin and the heart, not an issue of, well, it's right and it always goes this way. So when it doesn't, then something's amiss.
So there's no such thing as reverse racism. There's just racism.
Yeah.
Okay. The third term is systemic racism, but I'm going to pause on that because I think that's a pretty big conversation and you guys deal with it in the book, unless you want to jump in and say something quickly on systemic racism.
Yeah, I can. It also known in some spaces as institutionalized racism or institutional racism. It's the idea that systems are impacted by racism, so much so that we do not actually need people, or white people especially, to be able to participate in that system for it to bias or cause a disparity against a minority. So when we think of the banking system or we think of the judicial system, oftentimes we see disparities in regards to loans, or we see disparities in regards to the number of Black people compared to white people who are in jail or incarcerated. What some proponents of critical race theory, or some of the critical theories overall, would say is that a systemic injustice is happening. One, we understand that based on the disparity, but the system itself is plagued with racism. The system itself is broken. And so we need to either knock down the system, redo the system, but it's no longer about the people participating in the system. It's just that because racism, Derek Bell, has a word where he says that racism is constantly, it's like malleable. And so because racism is pervasive and malleable, racism is always moving, it's always shifting to benefit the person who created the system, so white people. And so when we think of systemic racism or institutional racism, we are thinking about racism inside of institutions that are meant or bent to keep white people at the top and to always bring disparities toward people of color.
So the short answer to our position on that is that I cite several biblical examples in the book of, I think people can create systems that end up in favoritism or denigration of certain groups. We think of Pharaoh making a law to kill all Hebrew boys. That's a system. Nebuchadnezzar saying you must bow down and worship this God or there will be consequences. That's a system. Where we take issue or where we differ is that we just think that a system can be set up to benefit any ethnicity or denigrate any ethnicity. It's not only a white to Black issue. So every system must be individually examined to see if it's an actual injustice according to God's standards.
And contrary to some of the more popular level writers today, I'm thinking of Ibram Kendi, especially, the idea that simply because there is a disparity, that does not automatically mean that racism is present. We must investigate. There must be evidence. We cannot say that simply because there is a disparity here, a disparity in incarceration rates, that automatically the system is bent against people of color. We need to have strong evidence and not just like cursory level evidence.